recording. The recording is going. And I want to let you guys know that Professor Saka, I reached out and said, "Hey, I heard you know something." And he goes, "Yeah, I think I can help you out." So this semester, we're working on water quality in two of the classes that I'm teaching, Design 320 and Design 330. And when you say water quality, it is a huge thing. I started working in water quality probably, I think it was my second year of college, and I've been working with it ever since. I started working at a sewage treatment plant, and then I started working for a piping company, and then back to sewage treatment, and then to clean water. And all along the way, I got a lot of information about water, and water planning and water infrastructure. And I think what you're going to hear from Professor Saka today is that we don't have maybe the most even distribution system in the world. We don't have assurance that we always have clean water to everybody in the world. But the focus of our two classes is to prepare designs that can help us overcome that problem. So that's why we're doing this. We want to know about the context for what we're designing. And we have a broad range of products that we're working with in the two different classes. Particularly in Design 330, we're working on water quality sampling, pumps to make that easier and better to do. You can't go solve a problem until you know where it is. So that's what we're saying here. Deep knowledge about context will help us do a good job. So Professor Saka is here to help us understand the context a little bit. And with that, and Professor Saka is a professor here at American River College, but I'll let him give you a little bit more of our background. So at this point, I'm going to be quiet and turn it right over to Professor Saka.
Thank you, Professor Schuster. Am I coming through okay on the audio and visual?
Sounds good, and I think it's coming.
Everybody's hearing me okay?
Yep, and it's coming out on the recording.
Cool.
Too.
Thank you, chat folks. Randy, or Professor Schuster, I might need your help in figuring out how to present. Oh, here we go. Maybe I can do it like this.
Oh, I have to unpresent mine. There we go. Now you should be able to go down to the present in the bottom right.
This is my first time ever using the Google Meet function.
Yeah,
so let's see here.
I know. That's how it. So in the lower right, you should see present now.
I want to show you.
Here we go. In the lower right, you should see present now.
Yep.
And and then
how are we doing?
There you go. Now it's coming up. There we go.
Now I have another window I wanted to pop out. If I switch my the screen over, are you seeing a map now or still the PowerPoint?
Still the PowerPoint.
Okay, so I'll switch back and forth then as we go. So, okay. Hey, y'all. My name is Professor Jeff Saka. I am currently in my third year of full-time work here at ARC in the sociology department. As I'm sharing my screen, I don't think I can see anybody. Let me go back here. Has anybody in the room today taken a sociology class? Anybody want to identify yourself? I don't see any names that jump out as being familiar, but you may have even been in one of my classes. Any sociology classes among us? Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to be going through today is in the service of getting us to where we want to be at the end of next week. Okay, like Professor Schuster described, when we think about identifying and trying to solve social problems, from a design standpoint, whether you're designing new infrastructure or whether you're designing a new set of laws or policies or resource distribution to try to address inequalities, it's really, really important that we start with the context, right? The motto of doing this kind of like equity-focused work is context before content, okay? So what I'm trying to do today, admittedly, this is a crash course. This is literally me. I've kind of cherry picked the best bits from about a 2-week unit that I give in my social problems class on poverty concentration and racial segregation. And I've put it into this today's conversation, with the hopes of establishing the kind of historical context in which we are going to be using mapping software to identify places in our city, right? Whether it's in Sacramento or any other kind of geographic region that you're interested in, for signs of historic poverty concentration and racial segregation, okay? Because we know from an infrastructure standpoint and from a social institutional standpoint that these areas that show signs of racial segregation and poverty concentration, that these are the kinds of places that are in the most need of intervention of some kind, okay? Next week, we'll start talking about this idea of environmental racism, and how we can use that concept to think through and kind of theoretically make sense of places like Flint, Michigan, right? Places like the Navajo indigenous reservations, right? Whereby their water has been contaminated with uranium because of federal government's mining practices and the safeguards that were not taken to protect their water, right? But in order to get there, we need to kind of run through today's content. Also, as a side note, please raise your hand or interrupt me, unmute yourself. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's any kind of concepts that you want me to make sure I go more slowly over, right? I tend to err on the side of going too fast. So if you would like me to pump the brakes a little bit or really kind of reiterate a point I'm trying to make, please do so. I'm unable to see you as I'm sharing my screen right now. I'm sure there's some kind of fix for that. But as long as you can hear me and you can see my screen, we're going to be okay. These are my goals for today, right? The first thing I want to do is I want to think about how and maybe even whether place matters, okay? How and maybe for whom does place matter, right? What kind of things might be affected based on where you live, where you grew up, okay, where you're living at this very moment, even, okay. How does space and place intersect with or interact with really important outcomes, okay. And then we're going to think through these two, what we call in sociology, social structural forces, okay. The structural forces of class and race, okay, poverty and racial segregation, okay. We're going to talk through these historic forces that mostly engineered by our federal government, and also to an equal, maybe slightly lesser degree, our state and local governments as well, that have created conditions whereby we see clear signs of poverty concentration and racial segregation today in our backyard in Sacramento and in other locations throughout our country. Okay, both rural and urban, right, and suburban, right. Segregation and poverty concentration or wealth concentration, right. They're not just accidents, right. They don't just fall out of the sky. They're not, quote, natural, right. These are designed. Okay, so as we're thinking through ways to identify problems and then to design our way out of them, to design solutions to them. Y'all are doing work on water quality right now, right? From a kind of a practical, tactile, physical kind of intervention perspective. There's also other, political interventions that we can design, ways of recalibrating how we fund public schools, how we fund or don't fund, public health, right? In order to do that work, right, the design work, it's important to know, what is the cause? What is the source of the problem, okay? If the source of the problem is about materials, then a material solution is appropriate, right? But when the source of the problem can be seen to be equally material and political and social, different kinds of design, different kinds of intervention become necessary, right? The right tool for the right job, right, Professor Schuster? You need to come at the problem with the tool that is best suited for addressing it, right? So we're going to talk through some of these historical forces of that have led to poverty concentration and racial segregation, okay? We're going to get really clear on this concept of redlining, what redlining is, and how it has shaped American society, American localities, this thing we call community, the role that redlining has played in Sacramento, at least, and then of course other cities around the country, and how redlining has been tried to be addressed. thus far. Okay. And then if we have time, I'm not totally sure we're going to be able to get to maps and Social Explorer today, but I'm hoping that we can stick the landing and end with a real quick introduction to the Social Explorer software and the utility of it and helping us identify geographic locations that show signs of racial segregation and poverty or poverty concentration that might be geographic places that that require some kind of unique intervention, right? Whether it's in terms of, like I said, policy change or resource distribution, or if it's infrastructure, right? We'll be using these maps as kind of a way to diagnose symptoms of these social problems, right? Okay, are there any questions before I move on? Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's exactly right, Professor Schuster. Yeah. While we're talking about these processes as historical, right? The task of today, right, and the task of your class here in this workshop is to understand your role in that history, right? That history is around us today, and that we need to understand the history, like I said, as a way to diagnose the problem, right? That it's not just about, it's not a simple solution, right? That we are dealing with legacies here, right? Legacies of inequality, right? And it can be really, really daunting sometimes to learn about these things and to feel like you have any kind of a power, any kind of control or agency to redirect these really powerful historical forces. But I think some of the exciting stuff that you all are doing in this class is that you're finding ways to do that, right? You're finding that there are practical solutions that you have as a unique set of skills you're building in this class with Professor Schuster to address these things, right? Even if it's just at the very micro level, right? Making sure that an individual house or an individual block or an individual community has cleaner water, right? That is a huge step, right? When you compare it to not doing anything at all, right? And it's still an imperfect step, right? So we're I don't know. Join me in the process of trying to understand the power of history and coming to grips with the small bit of agency that you have to act in the face of that history, right? And Professor Schuster, I'm not able to see the chat and talk at the same time. If anybody ever drops anything in the chat that you think is worth calling out to the class or that you want me to address, please feel free to interrupt me. That goes to everyone in the room as well. Let's see. Okay, I see the chat there. So are you still are you still seeing the PowerPoint when I toggle out of that window? Is this still the PowerPoint up right now for you, Randy, or Professor Schuster? Okay, all right. So yeah, I'm able to toggle out of that window and have y'all see it. So okay, cool. Thank you, Janice. Okay, so really quickly, I would like some folks to unmute themselves and answer this question just to kind of kick things off, and also introduce yourself. Just share with me your first name before you answer. What kind of things might be affected by where you live? Okay, I want us to think about form some hypotheses about what kinds of outcomes might space have. Specifically, how might folks who live in high poverty neighborhoods, how might their lives be impacted as compared to folks who do not live in high poverty neighborhoods, right? And this is, of course, I'm not necessarily talking about an individual's household poverty status, right? Because you can be rich and live in a high poverty neighborhood, right? We know that in general, the trend is that is less likely to have an affluent family living in a high poverty neighborhood, except in certain cases of things like gentrification and historically low income neighborhoods where affluent people start buying up houses and renovating them and all that. But how might high poverty neighborhoods be different, and how might what kind of effects might living in a high poverty neighborhood have on folks that grow up in those kind of spaces? What are some outcomes that you think that would be important to look at, or that might be distinct? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. So mobility. Absolutely. It limits the number, it limits how far away your job can be, for example, right? Or for folks who rely on a spotty public transportation system, it increases the things that can go wrong on your way to work, right? It increases the chance that you might show up late and get in trouble, something like that, right? Yeah, I see a hand up. Oh, it went away. Shoot. I'm sorry. If you have your hand up, please go ahead and unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi, this is Alex. I'm in one of Randy's classes. And I don't know how much factual information I have, but I've been reading about a thing called food deserts.
Yeah.
And as I was reading something about in certain areas, they have maybe some small like food mart or gas station, but if you don't have a car, you can't drive to a larger grocery store, and they only have like Twinkies and these processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
So then it kind of becomes a vicious cycle. So you can't afford better food, and then the health decline. And so there's a lot of things being affected because geographically there's not a grocery store with actual fresh vegetables.
Right. Access to fresh food, fresh fruit and vegetables, right? When the produce section at the place that you shop consists of like a banana and an apple on the counter by the register, right? That's not going to bode well for other kinds of outcomes as well, right? So I like, Alex, that you're considering how just this one thing like access to a grocery store with a decent produce section might be related to other kinds of impacts, right? Related to physical health and the kinds of healthcare needs that will a high fat diet or a diet consisting of processed foods might create down the road. Absolutely. Good. Other things, other distinct like life experiences that folks might have who who grow up in a high poverty neighborhood compared to a non-high poverty neighborhood. Haley, do I see your hand up? Or is that Alex's hand? I can't tell. Oh, there we go.
Hi,
Brenda, go ahead.
I'm Brenda, and I wanted to just touch on the school, also the access to good schools, because when you're growing up, you're assigned the closest one to you because of public transportation, the bus, and those who live in more affluent neighborhoods, that's where normally you find the private schools. So if you don't have a way to get to them, or you don't close by, then your chances of going into one of those schools is a little bit limited. Also, I mean, even if you had a scholarship or anything like that, but I think the education is one of the things that get affected also.
That's hugely important, Brenda. Really good insight there. On top of that, the reason why educational opportunity and access to quote unquote good schools looks so distinct from neighborhood to neighborhood by poverty concentration is because we've designed it that way. We fund our public schools K through 12 based on property tax revenue, meaning that in a neighborhood or a community with high property values, where all the homes are worth over $1 million, the revenue generated by those property taxes is significantly higher and is going to thus produce an educational budget for schools in that area that is significantly higher, right? Therefore, you get nicer buildings, better tech access, the ability to recruit and retain and to keep good faculty members, right? And people in those kind of school contexts, these high affluent area contexts, are also going to school with other similarly class positioned peers. Okay, whereby, or the flip side of that is that if you happen to be born, you just based on where you were born, the family you were born into, and the neighborhood you lived in. If home values are lower in that area, the school budget is going to be, not possibly, it's going to be lower based on how we as a society have decided to fund our public school systems, right? Absolutely. Good job, Brenda. One more. I see one more hand up. Alex, go ahead.
So what would be the downside if every school had, imagine all the tax revenues going into a big pot, and then all the money would be segregated equally between each county, I guess. So what would be the downside of that, and why is that not already being implemented?
Now we're talking socialism. I like it. It only took 12 minutes and we got to socialism. I love it. I love it, Alex. I think you're a sociologist at heart. Right. But again, so thinking about that kind of a question, Alex, and unfortunately, we don't have time today to go deep into that, but that is an awesome question and a great idea. An idea that many progressive educational reform activists would echo. Yeah, but in asking that question though, Alex, we're thinking about design and redesign, right? So in the same way that you're in this, with Professor Schuster thinking about designing practical devices and infrastructure, right? Redesigning our social institutions is another possible way to address these problems. I see you're still unmuted, Alex. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and to bring it back around, this is exactly applicable to water because it's the most basic human need besides air and shelter. So yeah. I think that, again, legislation could reflect the equality and also, for example, we were talking about the food desert. There's only really terrible bottled plastic water, plastic bottled water in a lot of these areas, and they don't have quote unquote mineral water, or they don't have a fresh water tap maybe accessible, but they have access to soda, for example. So right. I think this also applies to the water concept as well.
For sure. Absolutely, Alex. Thank you. Great. Okay, cool. Well, I shouldn't say cool. It's disheartening, but I'm glad to hear that y'all are kind of in the headspace that I hope you'd be in terms of thinking about problems, right? And how problems that we can talk about as being kind of detached from or divorced from space really require us to look at space, right? And the social, political, infrastructural forces that collaborate to make certain neighborhoods ecologically distinct from one another, okay? Socially distinct from one another, okay? So as we're talking about the differences from, between high poverty versus non-high poverty neighborhoods, the term that I want you to keep in mind is social institution, okay? So when we're talking about healthcare, when we're talking about education, when we're talking about law enforcement, when we're talking about political advocacy, when we're talking about the economy, right? The availability of high-paying jobs, right? These are all different, what we call in sociology, social institutions, okay? And that we know from empirical, rigorous social science that social institutions look different. We also know from really good urban planning research that physical infrastructure, right? Streets, sidewalks, building code, building quality, park access, right? These all look different as well, right? The availability of high-speed internet, right? Which is extra important these days, right? Because when we talk about high poverty areas, our minds tend to go to inner city poverty, but it's important to keep in mind that some of the poorest census tracts and the poorest communities in our nation are not urban. They are rural, okay? So it's important to also think about the diversity of high poverty neighborhoods, right? And what they look like and where they are, right? And how, based on where they are, different kinds of social institutional problems are likely to be in evidence, okay? So I want to show you a quick map. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to execute this flawlessly. Let me see here. I will shift my presentation window. Let's see here. Are y'all looking at my, let me see here, actually. All right. Are you looking at a map now? Can someone confirm? Awesome. Nice. Go me. Okay. So this data is a little bit old, but it's something that I've used in the past that I know that the data is good, at least for in 2014 when it was collected. And what we're looking at here is a map of the United States broken out by counties. And this is the life expectancy. This is how long, on average, a resident of that county would be expected to live in 2014. It's a little hard to see on my end. It's a little bit pale, but the darker the red, the lower the lower the average life expectancy. The darker the blue, the higher the average life expectancy. Can someone real quick just tell me one trend, one general regional trend in the United States that stands out to you? There's a couple that come to mind, but yeah, maybe someone who hasn't raised their hand yet today. Just give me one finding as you look at this map, knowing that the darker the red, the lower the average life expectancy, and the darker the blue, the higher the average life expectancy. What's one trend that you see? You can unmute yourself, or Randy, if you want to read from the chat, that'd be good too.
The southern states,
Okay, say something about the South. What's going on with the South?
a lot of poverty, a lot of people not living as long.
Okay, good. So we don't know about poverty necessarily, right? Because the data don't give us poverty data. Although I like that your mind is already thinking one or two steps ahead, like, whoa, how'd this trend come to be, right? But at least on its face, right, this map shows, you're right, that like on average, like there's on average lower life expectancy concentrated in the southern United States, right? Specifically, I'll zoom in here a little bit. This little pocket here in, I believe, is West Virginia, right? Is that right? That's West Virginia? No, that is Kentucky. This little pocket in Kentucky that goes into West Virginia, this like rural Appalachian kind of region. There seems to be like a dark red kind of cluster of counties there, right? We see a similar kind of cluster of dark red counties along the Mississippi Delta here, the borders Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, right? I will tell you that this is, again, one of the poorest regions of the country, right? With some of the social outcomes that are of most concern, right? In terms of like prevalence of poverty, prevalence of high school dropout, prevalence of diabetes and other kind of public health concerns, and also like completely devoid of like high paying jobs, right? But I will call your attention up here to, actually, I'm gonna go to right. I'm gonna zoom in, I'm sorry. I wanna go to, sorry. Oglala, Lakota County, South Dakota. The county, at least in 2014, that had the average lowest life expectancy in the United States. Folks in 2014 who were living in Oglala, Lakota County were living on average to only be 66.81 years old. This is about 13 years shorter lifespan than other folks in their state, and than other folks in the United States. You cross a magical line in the dirt, you go into Nebraska, right? Going from South Dakota to Nebraska, and all of a sudden life expectancy goes up about 13 years, okay? Just by crossing that line. So the question, right, that Janice already started to think about is like, how does this come to be? What is going on in Oglala, Lakota County that is leading to such a starkly different life expectancy, right? You cross another magic line going north, and all of a sudden, it's again, on average, people in the north, the county that borders Oglala, Lakota County and Pennington County are living on average to be about 80.4 years old, okay? Just for reference here, I'll go over here to, let's find, in Sacramento County, average is, again, 79 years old, right? Just about on par with our national average, just slightly less than our state average. Folks are living a long time in Marin County, though. I know that. Which again, it's about affluence, and it's where folks live who can probably access, preventative, proactive kind of healthcare measures. They can afford, good food that's not processed, right? All that. But yeah, someone give me a hypothesis. Someone who hasn't spoken yet. What do you think might be going on in Oglala, Lakota County? What's the story that is here?
Touching on sorry, my name is Haley.
Hey, Haley.
Like we talked about how like lower income jobs lead to lower tax rates, property taxes. Would it have to do with that as far as there's less access or there's less money for infrastructure, for like hospitals, healthcare, grocery stores?
Yeah, so all that. So I should also say I don't have like the definitive answer about what's going on in Oglala, Lakota County. All I know, I have the skills to point to like, hey, there's something going on here that we should figure out. But you're totally right on it, right? There's something that, the social institutions are clearly not designed in a way that are allowing people to live a long time, right? There's something going on here. And I'll cut to the chase just in the interest of time a little bit. So Oglala, Lakota County is a county that is entirely encompasses an indigenous Native American reservation. Okay, this is the story of the conscious neglect and financial, political neglect of Native indigenous people in our country by the federal government. Okay, not putting enough money into as y'all have said, Haley and Janice and everybody else, public services like healthcare and access to good food. I've sent Professor Schuster an article about uranium contamination in the water on Navajo reservations, and the federal efforts to try to clean that up. But yeah, ecological considerations as well, right? How safe the drinking water is, right? How safe the air is, right? I wouldn't be surprised to learn that there are, other sources of pollution in the air, for example, right? Right. So what this is bearing out, or what this is showing, is it's a story of systemic environmental racism that the indigenous Native American folks face in the U.S. Okay. Another thing to point out is that high infant mortality rate, that is when a child dies before the age of 2, a high infant mortality rate can also really drive down the average life expectancy, right? If you have, not high numbers of children who are passing away from, different kind of diseases or conditions before they're 2, that's going to, especially in more sparsely populated areas, it's going to drag the average life expectancy significantly down, right? So I would definitely want to look at infant mortality rates and what prenatal and postnatal healthcare looks like in Oglala, Lakota County, right? Okay, so this is an interesting map. I'll send Professor Schuster the link so you can look around at it. But as you move in, you can kind of see these little pockets of low life expectancy, right? That suggest very clearly that, to what extent are there social institutional problems there that are causing this low life expectancy, or what are they ecological? Are they in the quote unquote natural or physical environment, right? Is it about air and water, maybe, or is it political? Is it about jobs and economic vitality? Is it about drug pandemics, right? In rural Appalachia, we know that that was and in some ways still continues to be ground zero for the opioid addiction, right? As you have people overdosing in higher numbers in certain areas of our country than others, that's going to also affect life expectancy, right? Okay, let me see if I can go back smoothly to the PowerPoint. Yes, Janice, please go ahead while I'm doing this. You can go ahead and unmute yourself, Janice, yeah.
No, I didn't have my hand up, sorry.
Oh, that's okay, thank you. Did anybody else have something you wanted to add before we move on? So these couple of slides are just to start to cue up the idea that place matters, okay? And it matters in a lot of different, depending on the outcome of interest, whether it's life expectancy or educational attainment or employment or, just social, emotional, or psychological kind of outcomes, right? Place really, really matters. And to make sense of like how place comes to matter, right? We can look at this map here. This is the poverty rate, again, by county in the US. And the data doesn't line up perfectly, right? This is an estimate, a 4-year estimate rather than just being in 2014. But 2014 is in this mix, right? So, and we see here, those little pockets that we noticed of low average life expectancy seem to correlate, right? That little pocket in Kentucky going into West Virginia, right? That little pocket of low life expectancy on the Mississippi River, where Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana kind of collide here. And up here on the southern part of South Dakota, right, where, native indigenous reservations are, right? There seems to be a correlation between, poverty concentration and low life expectancy, okay? As social scientists, we don't talk often about causation. It's really, really hard for us to pinpoint just only two variable or only one variable that causes something, right? It's very hard to do that because if you can find another variable that's contributing also, you can't talk about causation as easily, right? So we talk about correlation rather instead of causation, okay? But there seems to be a correlation. Here's a little stretch of road that y'all might be familiar with. This is Highway 99. It runs down the middle of our state, and it goes through both rural and kind of more urban, suburban locations. This map was produced by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I believe, in 2015. I can't quite see through to the citation here about the year it was created. But RWJ put this thing out, and this looks at the average life expectancy, not by county, but by freeway exit, the exit of residency. And here, even in our own backyard, maybe some of this, for some of you, maybe even your front yard, we see a pretty striking disparity, right? The one up here, draws my eye. This is in Merced County. If you live on exit 187, you're expected to live on average about 78 years. You move 2 exits north on 99, and the average life expectancy goes up 9 years. Okay, it's pretty striking. Okay, and we can go through the similar kind of exercise about what's going on, how ecologically distinct are these 2 freeway exits? What's going on there? What's the contributing factors to this data, right? Because the data is there. Okay, the question becomes, what story is the data saying, and how can we intervene, right? What ought we do as individuals, as groups, as a society, right? What is our responsibility in the face of the data, right? What is our responsibility in the face of the stories that the data are telling us, right? And my call today, in trying to establish the context before the content that we're going to get to next week, is to consider how it's not just about things going on here and now today, right, in 2021, although there's plenty going on in 2021 that is contributing to social inequality, ecological, right, place-based inequality. But we have to open up the door and become familiar with the historical processes that have led to our communities today, okay? So what is concentrated poverty? This is where I'm gonna go pretty quickly through this. We spent a lot longer in my social problems class talking about concentrated poverty, but the punchline, social scientists define concentrated poverty as a phenomenon that occurs when 40% or more of the residents of a given social or a given geographic space are living below the poverty line, okay? Once you hit that 40% mark, social institutional life, social institutional health starts to look different, okay? This 40% mark wasn't just like, didn't just throw a dart at a board and like, oh, well, I guess it's 40%. This is based on the aggregated data and the findings of, urban scholars for, decades, okay? There's something distinct that happens in terms of social institutional health once that 40% threshold is breached, okay? Now that's not to say that, a place with 39% of its residents living in poverty is gonna be super different from a place where 41% of the residents are living below the poverty line. It's still kind of a rough estimate, but it's used to define like, well, what is a high poverty area, right? When do we believe that poverty is concentrated? And that 40% mark is used, right? Knowing full well that it's not perfect. It's just it's a back of napkin kind of a way to define this thing, right? Because in social science, if you're going to have a concept like high poverty neighborhood or concentrated poverty, you have to have a way to say like who's in that category and who is not in that category, right? In the same way that, our social institutions and our government says 18 is the magic point at which we become adults, right? There's probably not so much, you're probably not so much different from somebody if you're 17 and a half, looking at like an 18 and a half year old, but something happens on your 18th birthday on midnight that, the adult fairy comes in and taps you on your nose and you become an adult, right? It's a quick and dirty kind of a way to approximate this thing, right? But 40% is the threshold we use, okay? And in order to say a place is high poverty, you have to know two things, right? You have to, first of all, have a definition of what does poverty mean, okay? Because definitions of poverty can vary as well, okay? Often, especially when doing researchers who look at like national level data, they will use national level definitions, okay? Every year, the Department of Health and Human Services, our federal government, sets a poverty, what's called a poverty guideline, okay? Based on how many people live in your house, whether you're living by yourself or whether you have a child or a spouse, how much money did you make in the previous year? And that is the definition, that is the way that they operationalize poverty, okay? I took the slide out because it seemed kind of tangential, but I believe like if you're living by yourself right now, if you make less than $14,000, a dollar less than $14,000-ish dollars, you're considered to be living in poverty. If you make more than $14,000 a year, you're not considered to be in poverty by the federal government. Again, definitions of poverty at the national level can be problematic because making $15,000 in Sacramento is a lot different than making $15,000 a year in Biloxi, Mississippi, right? But nonetheless, we're going to sideline all the problems with the methodology and just know that like 40% is the threshold for defining concentrated poverty, and that poverty is often defined using the OPM, or the official poverty measure of the federal government. The second thing that you need to say that concentrated poverty exists is you have to have a geographic scale, okay? Now, while you can use things like city blocks, right? You can use things, you can scale up and use entire cities as your geographic scale. It is very, very, very rare for 40% or more of a city's population to be living in poverty, okay? Once the farther you scale up your geographic scope, the harder it is to find in any area where 40% of those residents are living below the poverty line. It happens. In my class, I showed this clip about Reading, Pennsylvania, which 4 or 5 years ago had like 43% of its city population below the poverty line, right? And all of the different kind of social institutional problems that both, shaped the number of people living in poverty, and how those social institutions like were shaped by the existence of that much poverty in the city, right? So you need two things. To say that concentrated poverty exists, you need to know what your definition of poverty is, and then you have to have a geographic scope, right? The census tract is the most commonly used geographic scale. It's an aggregation of a bunch of different blocks. It more or less correlates to how we think about neighborhoods, although sometimes like bigger neighborhoods in cities can have multiple census tracts that make them up. But next week, when we start looking at Social Explorer, we're going to be using census tracts as our kind of geographic unit of interest, right? So the question becomes, right, if we know how to measure it and how and when concentrated poverty exists, right, we have a threshold, we have a way to define it that's backed up by science. The question becomes like, what causes these things? Like, how does concentrated poverty come to be? Scholar of urban poverty named William, he's a sociologist at Harvard named William Julius Wilson. He argues that there's two forces that combine to create concentrated poverty as we know it today, right? Low income neighborhoods, ghettos, hoods, right? Whatever colloquial term you want to use today. And those two processes are explicitly racial policies. Historically, this has been what we're going to talk about in a second, which is redlining, right? Determining who is allowed to live where. And the four explicitly racist policies that led to barring non-white groups from economic opportunity, educational opportunity, political representation. These policies are a major structural force that has created high poverty neighborhoods today. But he also opens up the door for what he calls cultural forces, right? That in response to the ecological and the social institutional distinctiveness of these areas, he notes that different kinds of cultural dispositions emerge as well, right? And now Wilson has been critiqued like soundly, like maybe even aggressively by the field of sociology because he looks at culture, right? Because he opens the door for culture as in this picture, this larger kind of view of the causes of high poverty neighborhoods. Because a lot of sociologists are like, yo, you need to just like focus on the stuff that matters, which is structure. And Wilson does say that structure is far more important than culture, but I don't know. He argues that we need to keep both in mind, at least. That culture matters, okay? Structure might lead, but the culture matters as well. And he's been critiqued, in my view, like appropriately for bringing culture into the mix at all. But we're going to be focusing mostly on structure today, okay? And one of the key structural forces that we're going to talk about is this this term redlining. I would love to know what you've heard about redlining before, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure we get through this thing, right? So redlining is a process whereby, and I'm not going to hit I'm not going to hit each of these points today, but I'm going to go quickly, trying to get to the finish line before 13 minutes is up. Redlining is a process whereby the federal government outsourced to local real estate agents to conduct surveys of their cities, okay, to determine parts of the city that are high, quote unquote, high risk to support loans within. This process was instigated by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a branch of the federal government created as one of the New Deal plans to try to pull our country out of the Great Depression, okay? During the 1930s, there was a whole bunch of people who were suddenly thrown into poverty. And when I say a whole bunch of people, read that as white people who were thrown into poverty. And the federal government designed this whole slew of very expensive, very involved federally funded programs to try to pull our country out of poverty, right? To try to pull individual families up out of poverty. And one of those programs was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, whereby the federal government swooped in and bought up all of the mortgages that these the majority of whom were white families were suddenly unable to pay. Okay, the federal government saw it as their duty as a governing body to swoop in and buy up the loans, the mortgages that people had, the money that they owed on their house still. Because if you're a family and you're all of a sudden in poverty, unable to pay back your loan, you're going to not have a house anymore. And not only that, but the banks are going to be sitting there with the house and no one to pay the debt back, right? So it was a lose-lose situation that the federal government saw it as their role to alleviate. So the federal government partners with these local real estate agents and they say, okay, tell us what parts of your city are high risk, what parts are lower risk to support a loan within, okay? These local real estate agents explicitly used racial composition of neighborhoods to determine which areas were high risk. And when those areas were determined high risk, a red line or a red box was used to outline those neighborhoods. And any property within that red-lined area would not be given a help from the federal government to buy a home in those areas, okay? Well, we all know today, for anybody who has a home or is looking at buying a home, if you've heard the term the 30-year fixed mortgage, right? The Homeowners Loan Corporation, they were the originators of this idea, where this became the norm. Oh, it's a 30-year fixed mortgage, right? That did not exist before this program, right? As prominently, right? But it was through the active role of the federal government in setting this new policy that the 30-year fixed mortgage became the way that you buy a house, right? And redlining was a process whereby in non-white neighborhoods or in neighborhoods where the population is majority non-white, the federal government would not give loans, for people to buy homes in those areas, which means in order to buy a home in those areas, you have to be able to pay for it just about all in cash by yourself, right? That there's no way to finance this thing. You don't get the 30-year fixed mortgage, right? Where you, this way that you can evenly spread out the cost of what it would take to buy a home up front over 30 years. You don't get that, okay? So that leads to the majority of homeowners in those areas were people who lived outside those neighborhoods, okay? Landlords would eventually become slum lords, right? Who had, folks renting from them, okay? And there's a whole different conversation about what happens when the people who own the property don't live in the neighborhood, right? How dilapidated homes become more dilapidated. There's less political kind of representation and responsiveness to needs in those communities when the people aren't homeowners themselves making those claims, right? We'll sideline all that. Suffice it to say that redlining was explicitly racist, and it led to certain parts of town, i.e., non-white parts of town, coming to be high poverty neighborhoods. Okay, whereby white people and affluent white people specifically came to be concentrated in certain parts of the town, right? Certain parts of cities. This practice was made illegal in 1968 as one of the Civil Rights Acts, the Fair Housing Act. It became illegal to use race as an explicit criteria for giving a mortgage, for renting a place. It became illegal to do it. But important to note, even though it became illegal to use race as a criteria to determine giving a mortgage or renting out a house, in order to prove that someone violated that act, right? That a landlord or a company or a bank was using race as a criteria, you had to be able to prove intent, right? So because of that, because of the need to prove racist or racial intent, the 1968 Fair Housing Act was very seldom used successfully as a way to litigate, right? As a way to take someone to court, right? Because it's really hard to prove intent, okay? This is what a redlining map looks like in Sacramento. You'll notice these red boxed areas. These are parts of Sacramento where non-white folks lived, right? Where Black African-American folks lived, where Latinx folks lived. So, there was I believe a Japanese kind of community that was also redlined in Sacramento. Basically, any part of the town during the 1930s, when this assessment was made by local realtors, any part of town that was majority non-white was going to be deemed, quote, high risk, right? Given this D, this fourth grade, as being a high risk mortgage, right? As being something that the federal government should not, it would not be a smart move by the federal government fiscally to make, okay? And what this did is it laid the groundwork for home ownership, federally sponsored home ownership, to be disproportionately accessed by white folks, right? And we know from good social science research that the two major rungs to social mobility in that social mobility ladder are education and home ownership, right? Those are the two avenues whereby wealth accumulation starts to happen, right? Wealth accumulation that can be passed on to the next generation, right? So when the federal government has this explicitly racist policy that disproportionately creates wealth in white families that's passed from generation to generation, it catalyzed, or not, I mean, I shouldn't say that this started anything. This is an extension of federally sponsored policy going back to the beginning of the country. But it intensified this wealth gap, okay? The racial wealth gap, which has really important implications for neighborhoods, right? And space and place, okay? Looking at the time now, we got about 5 minutes. So the question, right, on our mind is, now that we know what redlining was, that it was made illegal in 1968, although that act didn't have a lot of legal teeth, wasn't very easily used to enforce racism in the rental market or the home purchasing market. What are we supposed to do, right? How do we deal with this legacy, knowing that redlining and these practices that happened just shy of 100 years ago are still with us today, right, have set in motion social cycles, social institutional processes that have shaped our neighborhoods today in Sacramento or wherever you might be living, right? There's no escaping the influence of redlining, right? What is our role in this thing? Okay, so we're going to talk next week more about, from an infrastructural standpoint, right? How do we respond to the infrastructural uniqueness of high income, of low income, high poverty neighborhoods, knowing that they're ecologically distinct, not just in terms of, social institutional or like conceptual stuff, but like the physical neighborhood itself is different, is distinct, has unique kinds of problems associated with it. What is our role in that, right? So we're gonna get there eventually, right? Let me skip these next couple of slides just to make sure I get all the important points in here today that I wanted to. So when the 1968 Fair Housing Act is passed, when redlining becomes illegal, yet does not go away, we talk about that as a shift from de jure discrimination, that is discrimination that is legal, backed by the law, right? This is Latin for the law, right? Where the law allows for discrimination to take place. We move from de jure discrimination to what we call de facto, by result, okay? Racism in the housing market did not go away after 1968, okay? It shifted. It was forced to move from legally sponsored, right? 35 years of legal, racism and racial segregation of our cities. It had to shift, right? We still very much have racial segregation in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our churches, our jobs. It's there. It just happens through a different set of processes that's not backed by the law as much, right? Or as explicitly. I'm going to skip through here. It's important to note there was a Supreme Court case in 2015 that allowed for the Fair Housing Act of 1968 to no longer have to prove intent, that it can be a Fair Housing Act claim can be made just by this thing that's called disparate impact. It's a little bit in the weeds. I'm going to skip through this. So there has been some change to the Fair Housing Act and its ability to be used to enforce, to call out and to litigate cases of racism and racial inequality. I'll skip all this. I'm sorry. There was an article that came out from two sociologists in this past fall that, and speaking to what Professor Schuster mentioned earlier, right? The how we are living today with the effects of things like redlining, right? And legally sponsored racial segregation. And they found, just looking at housing values objectively, right? This is how much your how much your home is valued, right? They found that when they did their research, and this is in 2015 when they collected their data, but they, as academics do, that didn't get published for 5 years later. They found that neighborhood racial composition was a stronger predictor of average home value in 2015 than it was in 1980. Okay, that the racial composition of your neighborhood, that specifically the percentage of white or non-white folks in a neighborhood, was a stronger predictor in 2015 than it was in 1980. Okay, and they found that in digging into that quantitative finding, they found that the process through which homes are appraised, right, through which it's estimated how much homes are worth, right, that it's in the home appraisal process that the racial demographics of a surrounding community come to shape the monetary value of a home, the projected home value, right? Which is still a process, right, born from explicitly like racial ideology, right, white supremacist ideology that comes to affect racial wealth gaps, right? If you own a home in a majority non-white area, the exact home, right, physical home, if you pick that home up with a helicopter or something and you plopped it in a majority white neighborhood, the value of that home would increase. Okay, so Professor Schuster was talking about the case where who is buying the home has an effect, right? The prospective home buyer, their race has an effect on property value. But we have this empirical research that shows that the racial demographics of a neighborhood are also shaping, how much money a house is worth. Okay, outside of the house by itself, right? The racial demographics of the surrounding area matter, right, and matter more in 2015 than they did in 1980. Okay, so we don't have time to get through racial segregation. I don't have time to introduce you to the index of dissimilarity, which tells us when racial segregation exists. Let me just skip through to the end here to make sure that there's not something else that I really wanted you to leave with. Okay, so I was going to leave with Social Explorer. I'm 1 minute over. I didn't stick my landing after all, but I feel okay with today. Okay, so we will jump off into Social Explorer, the content. So hopefully the context has been set. We can start getting to the content, the Social Explorer stuff when we meet next week. And I also want to next week turn to this idea of environmental racism and making sense of how ecological impacts, the ecological impacts of living in high poverty areas, right? And the disproportionate impact that these environmental stressors, environmental hazards have on communities of color based on these forces that we talked about today that have shaped what our communities look like and who lives in them, right? All right.
Morrow. Sorry, I didn't have my mic on, although you could hear me. I wasn't recording that last little part of me. We'll have a chance to discuss this through classes tomorrow a little bit and to talk in the context of what our design work is for this week and next week. It's just really good to know. I'll also point you at Dr. Carlson's video. She did an introduction to redlining for us last semester, and it's a little bit hard to read some of those CC&Rs because you just don't understand how explicit they are until you've read some of them. So we didn't really explicitly talk about what some of those racist and redlining things were, but if you go back and look at the one that I posted, you'll see them, and there's just no way around it, and it becomes very obvious then. And then what Professor Saka is talking about it being a primary factor to wealth development and the like will be good. And then we're hoping, he's talked about the program or the subscription to Social Explorer. We have a meeting tomorrow where we're hoping to have enough seats that you can all actually play with it a little bit yourself. So we're looking forward to that. And then the trick will be getting that applied in our designs. So that's the cool thing. You've got a context, you know about it. We're giving you some information that says that can't just sit back and let it flow past you. There's our water thing. That we want to actually be proactive in some fashion. So, and just learning good design principle is it. And I really appreciate the fact that Professor Saka drew a comparison between design of infrastructure, social structure, the ecology around us, and our design process that we go through. It's the same thing, folks, right? It's just that, as he said, we're maybe working with some wood and metal and dirt, and that the others we're working with people, and I'd say probably that working with people has far more impact, but I'll still stick to wood, metal, and dirt because it's easier for me. How's that sound? Cool. All right. Well, thank you. Any last words, Professor Saka?
So I plugged into the chat a link to a website that will allow you. It's this activist and author named Josh Begley overlaid historic redlining maps on some major California cities and you can click. It's like it's Google Maps kind of a interface. You can click on those individual neighborhood maps, and it'll bring up the qualitative comments that were used by the local real estate agents to inform the homeowners loan corporation about what grades to give them. So yeah, mess around with that link.
Right.
The one for Oak Park is especially explicitly racist and hard to read at some in some spots, but it's an official government document that, you know, it's stamped with a date, and the government used the information in those reports to guide federal policy, fiscal policy that you know, shapes not only what our neighborhoods look like, but what racial wealth gaps look like. I see some. Are y'all having a hard time accessing it?
It came up. It came up for me, so it could just be.
Okay.
I'll make sure that we can get
Yeah.
to that. But I was able to pull it up. So.
Okay. Yeah. If you just Google Josh Begley redlining Sacramento, it should come on up. Yeah, Haley, that's your hand. Or sorry, Janice, that's your hand.
I'm sorry, I keep putting my raised hand by accident.
Okay.
That's all right.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Haley, did you have a comment? I see you're unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I dropped my email in there too. If anybody has anything you wanna holler at me about, I'd be happy to talk to you later.
Cool.
Yeah. Otherwise, I will plan on seeing everybody next week.
All right. Thank you so much, and we'll get back into this in a little bit. Thanks, you guys.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, folks, I'm going to log off and get to my other meeting. I'll see you guys later.